Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. Actually, this is the start of a new series, which I ended up following several rabbit holes as I tried to lay this one out. Um, I'll be the first to admit that I'm still trying to find the right balance in terms of what kind of information to provide and, how much to share at a time and stuff like that. So I do appreciate your patience. The last series, as I've said before, just kind of got off into the weeds a bit too much. So I'm trying to find maybe a higher, more summary level of information that can then extend out as I feel appropriate. So, as what I have planned now for maybe 6 or 7 episodes, could I could probably expand each of those out into a more detailed series, which I won't do at this time. So these videos are probably going to be a bit longer than what I've done in the past. We'll see how it turns out. So ultimately, the other thing I was looking at is what is the purpose of this YouTube channel? What am I really trying to do? There are things that can be entertaining. There's people who do podcasts for various reasons. And for me, a lot of it really still comes down to kind of a legacy of my information or of what would have helped or what did help the journey that I made. I mean, I'm not still in these states of non-ordinary states of consciousness, and somehow I was able to bushwhack my way through. But so many people still seem, run into roadblocks from the very system that's supposed to help them, or misunderstanding, or there's so many things that's what I hope to do with this. And yeah, we'll see how that turns out as well. So, as I, uh, one thing I should say is, anything you consume anywhere, even from a newspaper, where you consider people to be reporters, objective investigators, and stuff like that, you're still always getting the person always makes decisions about what to include and what to exclude. So you'll always have my personal bias in this. You do with anything, that's just how it is. And so while I want to present, I don't necessarily even want to present like both sides, because the side that would have helped me wasn't even present. So if this comes off as biased, who cares? I don't even care about that, because what I care about is helping get tools out there, or at least for consideration, that might help people. And so along that line, this first episode is about how to perhaps reframe or reconsider language that is emotionally loaded, stigmatizing, difficult. And the reason I want to do that is because, not that I'm a fan of necessarily using the words, without consideration of the impact they have, but for me, some of the research I've done, the people at the time, especially 40, 50 years ago, are using stigmatizing language, words. They use words of psychosis and schizophrenia and that type of thing. But they use it in a very, what I would consider, very respectful way. And not in terms of, this person has a disorder. That's another one I'll talk about. But by kind of getting over that hump of, okay, this is how this person is using this word, they don't mean to trigger a response in me because of how it's been used either against me or whatever in the past. Sometimes that can open up opportunities to understand other research that's been done. And so, yeah, so hopefully this can be of some value to people. So I'm starting off with the two words that I consider to be most stigmatizing as of 2025, 2026 timeframe. The first one is psychosis, which I'm not a fan of. I actually have a chapter of it in my book. Oh, and I don't have my book handy, so I can't wave it. Oh, well. But I have a chapter on that in there of how to reframe psychosis, and I go into more detail. But the simple version is basically psychosis. One way to look at it is it's a split from reality. And so people will consider that, a split from that which is real. Well, in the mystical side of things, this whole realm is an illusion. I mean, the Course in Miracles says that. My mom used to study the Course in Miracles. She's walked on. I like the way of a Native American friend of mine. I learned that from her. She passed in 2019 and studied the Course in Miracles. And she'd say, "Don't worry, Penn, this is all illusion." And then even Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And so when we look at something and we think it's, hard and solid, really that is pun, sorry, that what that is a bunch of atoms vibrating so fast that you cannot break that plane, and so they take on this sense of solid material, even though it's just a bunch of vibrating things moving real fast. But this concept of reality and illusion, so if you're splitting from that which we call reality, but others call it the illusion, what are you splitting towards? So if you're splitting from this thing that could be the illusion, the framework we build up of how to operate in this world and that it'll work for us, and we split from that, what are we splitting towards? And that's where some people who go through these intense experiences talk about, finding reality or searching for reality. And if you pay attention to the words or the descriptions, as soon as I hear that, I'm like, oh yeah, this is more of a mystical thing than it is an illness, a physical, brain chemical thing. One thing I forgot to mention is that a number of these types of experiences in the reading I've done, and I've mentioned it in other videos, is the term ineffable comes up quite a bit, which means indescribable, cannot be described by words. And so when a person's struggling with trying to come up with words to describe it, expect it to sound weird, expect it to be difficult to understand, because the person is experiencing something that is beyond verbal description. So anyway, psychosis, like I say, there are works out there that have psychosis in the title and stuff like that. And in fact, a couple of works I've come across mention psychosis as a process, and I'll mention that in some upcoming episodes. The next word I would say that is most stigmatizing is that of schizophrenia. I've called it the granddaddy of them all. And back in May of 2020, I read an article in Mad in America, and I forget which one it is now. I have a hard time finding. I'm one who searches on the web, and I seem to get different results back all the time. But basically what I learned is that had I gone through my experiences back in like the 70s, I probably would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Bipolar didn't exist at the time. Manic depression was there. Not that bipolar doesn't cut it either. But that was a hard thing to take. And I was like, oh crap, and here's the thing is that at the time, there was research into people who benefited from this process. There's a phrase, not very well known, but there in one of Joseph Campbell's works, he mentions someone's research that spoke of essential schizophrenia, the kind that's positive. And this would tie in more with like shamans, the mystics, that type of thing. And people were recognizing, oh, for a percentage of people, this is actually a good thing. But of course, that got dropped. And the counter to that was paranoid schizophrenia, which just a few years ago, when I came across this concept of essential schizophrenia, I thought, well, where is that? And it's very difficult to find information about it, or at least it was for me. And even in one of the things I came across is that you don't hear about paranoid schizophrenia either anymore. You hear just of schizophrenia. So back in the day, they were trying to say of this thing. Now, sorry, I distracted myself, but they were trying to say, hey, there's maybe some benefit to this thing that can be very traumatizing, very difficult, not just for the person involved, but very frightening for people around them or whatever. I should have mentioned is that the word stems for schizophrenia, the schiz part is the like from scissors, the cut, the split. And phrenia is the mind. So it's a split mind. Well, that ties in with ego collapse, which I've mentioned in other videos. And that ties in with this ego that we've created of how to function in this world, and something is trying to emerge from it, something that's healthier, something that's better. And people, the natural tendency is to try and shove the chick back into the egg or the butterfly back into the cocoon, which of course doesn't work. So, but anyway, that's one of them that I think those are the two, psychosis and schizophrenia. And that's part of why when I learned that in May of 2020, I thought, if I have to take that on, I will. I won't necessarily like it, but I will. And it doesn't have to be a permanent condition. That's part of the problem, is it can be very beneficial. It can be described as a process, which is an opportunity for growth and transformation. So for me, bipolar, I've mentioned I was diagnosed with bipolar, which even when I was in Banff going through what I've always called a breakdown, severe stress breakdown, I knew I'd end up diagnosed with bipolar. I mean, I knew enough other people who tried to describe their own experiences, this ineffability, to know that, oh, this is what they're trying to describe, these non-ordinary states of consciousness that we don't do a very good job of describing collectively. But for me, bipolar doesn't even come close. And even when I was still in Banff, in the first few days of this experience, I said, no, you don't get to call me anything less than tripolar, which is mind, body, and soul. And even despite the difficulty I was having, I knew that this was some kind of process. The word enlightenment came up, but I would say rebalancing. It was some kind of an attempt to shed and bust out of these toxic systems that I'd been enabling, or that I'd been crutching or exposed to for many years, for almost half my life at that point in time. So this idea that I have bipolar disorder, it's like, no, the world around me that I was crutching had some serious disorders related to them. So before you get to lob it at me, let's talk about those. And in fact, it didn't go unnoticed, and I think I mentioned this in another video, is that at one point so March 28th was the crisis point. That's when I fell to my knees sobbing, convinced I'd be killed in a plane crash, and felt the souls of two friends of mine helping me out. It was probably within 2 or 3 days of that I was looking at all this stuff and going, what is this? Is this bipolar? And I looked and I thought, and I happened to have a $2 Canadian coin in my hand. And I'm like, no, this coin is bipolar. It's a $2 coin and it has a polar bear on it. The planet is bipolar. Magnets are bipolar. Humans, by their very nature, are much more than just cut into two, right? There's much more to consider there than to try and narrow it down to a condition of bipolar. And so mine was a tripolar rebalancing. That's one. Or I've even thought multipolar. There's probably more. You can talk about emotions. You can talk about, all sorts of different facets of the human experience. We're multifaceted people. And when that gets out of balance, you end up having, parts of the ego that need to be reframed and restructured. Schizoaffective is one that comes up. The word etymology, basically the schiz part is, again, the split. Affective is emotion. So apparently the idea behind that is a splitting of the emotional abilities. The way it's presented is that it's a combination of schizophrenia and bipolar. So you have like both of them. And I'm just like, man, and I didn't learn of it until about 2003 or 2004, when I was still struggling with some of the anger and the lack of closure of the whole experience I went through in 98. And when I laid out enough stuff to this guy who, frankly, on more than one occasion, I didn't have to actually wake him up, but he was kind of dozing off, which, right there, I'm kind of like, So anyway, when I laid out enough stuff, he said, well, I wouldn't say you have bipolar. I was like, whoo, oh, good, okay, because I was using terms like breakdown. I didn't have the term spiritual emergency at the time, that type of thing. And he said, I would say you have schizoaffective disorder. And, and I remember thinking, damn, and you guys wonder where stigma comes from? I'd never heard of it before. And I just thought it was ridiculous, you know? And the best part about it is I wasn't impressed with this guy anyway, but if you've ever been in counseling, some people might be wondering as well, geez, if he almost fell asleep on me, that'd be it, I'd be done. But within the system, it can be difficult to even find people to work with that you're comfortable with, comfortable enough with. And I wasn't at a point of just being able to stop. There were a couple more sessions I wanted to have. And so after the last session, when I said, I think we've done enough. And he, of course, wanted to continue on and do something else. And I thought, no, if you can't even stay awake, I'm not, I'm not going to do that. And so on the way home, there was a car the owners lived just a few blocks from where I lived, and it was a red Focus station wagon. And at the time, I had a red Ford Focus or Ford Escort. Red Ford, I named him Robert, as in Robert the Red Ford. Even his mechanic used to call him Bob. But I pulled up behind this car, and the reason I noticed it is the license plate was personalized to read Maple Leaf. And of course, since my experiences were in Canada, I'm sensitive to Canadian references. And I love, that here's this red car with this reference to Canada. And I pull up behind it. And as we were driving along one of the main, not main thoroughfares, but one of the, streets, it turned on its blinker and it was going to turn left. And I thought, what are you turning left there? That isn't where you guys live. And sure enough, then it kind of, you could tell the driver's like, what am I doing? I'm not turning left there. And it turned off the blinker and it started to accelerate. Well, I happened to look up at the street and it was Silver Maple. And so again, here's this reference to maple, which again I make to Canada and my experiences there. So within just 15 seconds, here's these two references that I could make to the maple leaf, and such. That for me, it was just kind of like these powers of sensitivity and what I notice. It was kind of like this: the universe is going, "Hey, Penn, remember Canada? There was value to that. There was value to that. Don't forget that. We're still here. These forces that bring synchronicity into my life or whatever." So yeah. So this whole schizoaffective thing, it's like, oh, good grief. Um, let's get into some more basic terms. Things like illness. You hear about serious mental illness, and in fact, a few years ago, I saw someone comment on an SMI, and I was like, "What is SMI?" Oh, serious mental illness. You're told that these are illnesses instead of reactions or responses. Um, I pulled up just to get some rough definition of the word: an unhealthy condition of body or mind, a sickness. Well, it's one thing to say an illness is an unhealthy condition of body or mind. And like I say, if this is a process, you could even question of, that would make childbirth an illness. It's a transitional process, right? Um, a disease or other condition affecting the health of an individual, including mental or physical health. So here we're with disease, illness, you have that negative connotation to it right away. And I think a number of people, just kind of the general public, look at illnesses as, well, one, negative, but a number of them look at it as, being biochemical or biological in nature, in terms of viral or bacterial or something like that. Sickness, definitely. And that's, I think, a lot of what people like me reject, is that there's this concept of, oh, I'm the one who's ill. No, I was in an ill environment. I was in an environment that makes people ill. I mean, this is more the coal mine breathing in a bunch of dust that affects the individual. And that doesn't necessarily affect them all, but affects enough. Disease, another one that I pulled up, and a number of people will talk about disease as dis ease, something difficult. I know when I first heard that, I thought, yeah, that works. But it's the same kind of thing as illness, right? A disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that has a distinctive group of symptom signs or anatomical changes, and often a known cause. So again, it's focusing on the individual as opposed to what they're exposed to and what they're responding to. Um, let's see. Yeah, PubMed even says patients suffer illnesses, doctors diagnose and treat diseases. Illnesses are experiences of discontinuities in states of being and perceived role performances. Diseases in the scientific paradigm of modern medicine are abnormalities in the function and or structure of body organs and systems. So there's this whole linguistic element of these being negative rather than being potentially something of value. Chaotic, difficult, challenging, which you could still say is negative, but overcomable. Or I don't know if that's even the right word, but crap, I'm dealing with ineffability again. Um, the word disorder is one worth taking a look at. And part of the reason is because the way the diagnostic manual called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, basically calls everything a disorder. And so it's behavioral clusters. And so if you exhibit enough of these, it's almost like a checklist they try and make. If you exhibit, 7 out of 10 behavioral traits, then you have this disorder. Well, let's apply it to organizations. Let's apply that to corporations. Let's apply that other places, And if you're constantly in a disordered system, and don't have a disorder, maybe you're the one disordered, right? You should have disorders in a disordered system or in a dysfunctional system would be the better word. Because the way this one gets reframed, and I recalled it as I documented, there's a book by a PhD social anthropologist. His name's James Davies, and I'll talk about him more in the future. One of his books is called The Importance of Suffering, which came out, I think, in 2014. It's kind of expensive. I think it's like $55 new. I found it used on a used book site. But anyway, I remembered when I read it a few years ago that, oh yeah, he kind of reframes disorder in a way that meant something. It's in the chapter on productive suffering, which right there's a potential value for suffering, whether it's depression, anxiety, and he mentions that early on. Regardless of the specific type of suffering, there is a possibility of productive suffering, that there's value to it, there's reasons for it. But the way he describes it is he looked again at the word etymology. The term dis means take away. Okay, so disorder. The way he describes it is order is being taken away from you. Our internal security and safety is being removed. It's not a sickness in the self, but as a natural ordering within the self. And we have been disordered and have the opportunity to reorder ourselves into some new configuration. So that in order to, pun intended, not really, but in an effort or in a need to create something new, we first have to move away from the order that we have. And before that, in the book, he doesn't mention the hero's journey, which is attributed to Joseph Campbell, but he does talk about rituals of passage, I think is what he calls it, where basically these rituals of passage or rituals of growth is that where people leave, where, they're ordered group, where they're comfortable, they leave and go through some transformation and come back with useful information from that transformation. And in the simplest form, that's how the hero's journey could be described. The hero's journey has a number of steps around it, but that's the most basic form of that. So this disorder is a way of moving away from the order that we've created that we live in. That goes to the idea of the ego, or what I've called the experience base, which I know I mentioned in the first series. I have a video on experience base. So I like that approach to talking, to reframing disorder. I'm not a fan of the word. It's overused. Um, it's been used in a stigmatizing way of that this person has these illnesses, sicknesses, disorders, or whatever, instead of looking at it as, wow, this person needs to go through some kind of transformation. That what they've experienced and built up to this point is not at all working for them. And there's something that needs to be reordered. And so, in order to reorder, you have to go through and disorder things. I mean, it's kind of like, cleaning out your closet, right? That, you put things in a certain way and then you're like, I don't need half of this, or this is no longer functioning. You got to pull it all out. And it makes a mess out of everything with the intent of determining what to shed, determining how to reorganize things or whatever. So, and I think that's why, the term disorder only focuses on that specific part of, you're not functioning in an ordered way anymore. Well, maybe I've been crutching too much stuff. Finally, along this, I also noticed that there are cases where people will be diagnosed with something that's treatment resistant. I hear it most with depression, treatment resistant depression or treatment resistant. I don't know if they use it just across everything. I look at that as meaning, yeah, you haven't been treating it right. That more than likely where that comes in is where people have been put on these various drugs and then go through the process of having to, increase the dosage, and so on, or add in other drugs or whatever. Oh, you have treatment resistant this, therefore we need to add in another drug or two, which can be very dangerous. I mean, that's what leads to what gets called drug cocktails. Um, Years ago, I thought, well, that's because you're not treating the right thing. So it's not that whatever this person is dealing with is resistant to treatment. It's that your treatment is bad. Your treatment isn't appropriate. And maybe there's an entirely different way of looking at this and supporting a person or helping them through it than that specific treatment. So whenever I hear someone talk about treatment resistance, I'm like, yeah, you're probably not treating it correctly to begin with. A few other terms that I thought I'd throw in here, not necessarily stigmatizing, but can be. Even the term crazy. I don't tend to look at my experience as crazy anymore, but at the time I did, because even leading up to it, I had thought, if you go crazy in a crazy world, are you sane? Kind of like -1 times -1 is +1. I mean, is it good to go crazy in a crazy world? Is there value to it? And then it happened. I was like, oh man, I had no idea. Um, I did pull up the word etymology because initially the word did deal more with these mental experiences. In the 20th century, it took on any number of different meanings, including, oh, that's crazy, meaning, oh, that's cool, or that's good, or whatever. Originally, it did have to do with mental conditions or behavioral conditions. My understanding is the word etymology from the late 16th century dealt with full of cracks, which coming across that, I was like, well, yeah, that's that Kinsekuri process. And again, that's that idea of growing beyond something that is rigid and not not allowing you to grow beyond it, not the transformational part. Another term that comes up is madness. That has some traction in what I call the reform effort, or that because of Mad in America, which is a book that came out, I think it was in the late 90s, Robert Whitaker. I have the interview with him. That was his book on the history of schizophrenia. And, the result of him asking, hey, how come things aren't better? If we've been trying to deal with this for 50 years, how come things haven't really gotten better? And how come the outcomes have actually gotten worse? The madinamerica.com, I have a few articles I'll link to. One of them, because there's a term coming up that I wrote an article on. You can go and search on my name, and actually I have a link to the author page in the notes. But from that, you hear terms like mad. I don't hear it a whole lot, but that is a take on is the gay pride movement. That homosexuality was in the DSM. I think I can't remember which one it was finally removed, but that's where back in the 70s in the gay pride movement, people said, "Hey, this isn't a serious illness. This isn't a mental illness, and quit stigmatizing us this way." And so that's where they came up with I'm proud of what I am. I'm proud of who I am and how I function in this world. And so that's where you get some of these mad pride. For me, just the word mad, it kind of ties in with angry, and I can do a play on words, I should be angry at how disastrous my experiences were back in 98. But overall, I don't like to be bad. I don't know, it's a subconscious or something. Another word that comes up often is irrational, which earlier, I can't remember which books I was reading just in early 2025, a couple of them mentioned the role of both logos and eros, where logos is this rational mind part, the thinking, the brain, where eros is the heart. And I think that even goes back, that goes back to the Greeks and everything, where the heart has a mind and the brain has a mind. And it's kind of, I consider it kind of a yin relation. And in our society, in this rational mind, right? And so too often irrational gets related to emotion. And think about it, that's if someone bursts out emotionally, they're irrational. Well, for me, this goes back to when I was in Banff. There was a part of this looking at the number system, that you have whole numbers, you have fractional, you have positive, you have negative, you have these elements of numbers. And I said, you don't get to reality until you include the irrationals. So the real number system includes both the rational numbers, which I know I'm going nerdy on you. What? Anyway, the real numbers, reality in that sense, includes both the rational numbers, which are those that can be written as a fraction. They have a limited set, as a decimal point, you truncate it at some point, or it has a repeating pattern. The irrationals do not have that. They are just, there's no set pattern, there's no repeating pattern, and you just go on and on. The number pi is considered irrational. So that's how I look at when people say, kind of speak against, oh, that's irrational. And I'm like, yeah, irrational is part of reality. I mean, look at the world we live in, what we do to each other. There's irrationality in that. And so that's my way of, tying it to this eros, tying it to the feeling as opposed to the thinking. We're basically saying that to feel things is irrational. Yeah, let's back that one up and try it again. Okay, so that's how I am. Like I say, every time I come across somebody trying to say, oh, that's irrational, I'm like, uh-huh. So the other terms I'd already mentioned, stress or nervous breakdown. One counselor I worked with in the spring of 99 didn't even like me using the term breakdown, because she recognized it was a breakout and a breakthrough. And in fact, you could say the breakdown is the disorder part. It's taking away from the order. And then you have the transition into a breakout into something new, and a breakthrough that allows you to come back into It ties in with the separation, the transition, and the return of the hero's journey. Again, actually, in that same section where James Davies spoke about disorder, he also mentioned breakdown or breakout. He even used the term cracking up, which is an older term, but it has to do with that break apart of something that's no longer working. He said, under the new assault of emotional turmoil, the inner defenses and props that held us together abruptly collapse before a new tide of feelings come that color the world in different shades. So, it goes to the value of that. And through the wound, we separate from our ordinary and everyday life, passing through the open door into the next stage of ritual, transformation, and transition. And seeing that quote or mentioning the wound, the first chapter in my book, I mentioned Rumi's quote, "The wound is where the light enters you." And then I say, what I've said to that quote is there were massive wounds. And I shouldn't laugh. I mean, I get that for people in that state, it hurts like hell. When you're in it, it hurts like hell. It's confusing as hell. And for anybody who's watching this who's in that state, I am sorry for the pain you're in. May you and resources come to you and something help you come through. And that is what the mental health system should be doing, but too often it doesn't. Burnout is another term that I wrote an article for Mad in America of how in Germany they treat burnout as a medical condition. And I raised the question because I actually exhibited signs of burnout, severe burnout, 2 years before the breakdown, which could be called a psychotic break. And even if the time in Banff was not considered a psychotic break, I could easily say that the failures in the system pushed me into states into states of consciousness that could definitely be called psychotic, even to the brink of what I consider to be insanity, which happened in the third week of May, 1998. And I never would have hit those really difficult states of consciousness had the system worked. So that is part of the elixir I have to bring back from my hero's journey. So, but yeah, so burnout, it's the idea that I pulled up just, Google these terms, and see what they say and what part of it makes sense or not. And so I searched on burnout, and there were a few different descriptions. One is the reduction of a fuel or substance to nothing through use of combustion, right? Well, that's a work environment. They'll keep demanding more and more and more fuel until you feel depleted. Failure of an electrical device or component through overheating, trying to figure out solutions to, 25 different problems you're, juggling in certain environments. Physical or mental collapse caused by overwork or stress. Now, isn't that funny that that's not in the DSM, the diagnostic manual? Really? It's in Germany's system. That creates a different problem. The method of, and this one I just thought was interesting because it's the method of producing textile patterns where a design is etched by chemical to destroy the surface fibers. And so that's a burnout onto that. Another term that I don't find that stigmatizing, spiritual emergency, was coined by Stanislav Grof and his second wife, Christina, which is a play on words of both emergency, meaning there's urgency, an urgent situation, emergency of, needing assistance and, needing competent assistance, but also the concept of emergence, which is, really more that transition. It goes to the idea that the sum of parts, the sum of parts is greater than the result is greater than the sum of the individual parts is how I look at it. But it's the idea of growth into something better is the idea of emergence. And so spiritual emergency is actually a play on both of those terms. I described that in the book a little bit. And then Carl Jung had the concept of individuation, which I don't consider to be a stigmatizing word. He basically was saying, in order to be an individual whole person, you have to deal with what's in the subconscious and the shadow and bring that to consciousness so that you can integrate as a whole person. Not, we all shove stuff off as a way of growing and learning and dealing, but in order to be that full person, we need to deal with that stuff that we've shoved off. Another term that I don't consider to be stigmatizing is holotropic. This was also created by the Grofs. Holo, it basically means movement towards wholeness. So again, just wanted to put out here some of the different terminology and especially deal with those that are considered stigmatizing. I use the words that are stigmatizing. I try and use it in a respectful way, similar to people whose work do the same. I don't tend to use them a lot, but and I would say be very careful using some of those terms because it still promotes a nervous system response for a number of people. And I think for now it should, because there is stigma around those words. And some of that, I guess I would say it's not even necessarily stigma, but there is a response to those words that I am supposed to accept that I have a chronic condition that cannot be cured. There's no cure. And I'm supposed to accept that I have the disorder, that I have the illness, that, yeah, come on, really? And now we're getting into modeling, which is a statistical thing. I'm thinking of how stupid the models are, which I will touch on I believe it's the next episode. So thanks for your time. Hopefully this was of value, or at least could be used as referential material. If you find yourself in discussions or that type of thing, to help bring about the change that I feel is definitely needed. So anyway, thanks for joining me. Have a great day, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks.